No paragraphs, same cold tone. Let's go. It started as mockery. Intelligence reports dismissed it as improvised nonsense, field junk welded together, patched steel, salvaged engine parts, something barely deserving the word vehicle. No factory line, no official designation, no procurement chain, just Australians in a forward zone assembling what larger forces would have written off as scrap. But war has never been decided by appearances. The machine did not need to look invincible, it needed to function long enough to alter tempo. Larger armies depend on doctrine, armor classifications, threat recognition systems, predictable battlefield categories. If something doesn't fit the category, reaction slows. That delay was the opening. The so-called scrap tank wasn't built to dominate head-to-head, it was built to disrupt assumptions. Light frame, unexpected heat signature, irregular silhouette. It confused targeting software calibrated for standard profiles. It moved where heavy armor wasn't expected to move, through terrain dismissed as non-viable, across angles considered tactically irrelevant, and that is where imbalance begins, not in firepower, but in expectation. The U.S. force in the area possessed layered support, reconnaissance drones, armored mobility, structured response chains. On paper, overwhelming superiority. But superiority assumes clarity. The Australians introduced distortion. The improvised vehicle became bait, shield, decoy, and spear depending on the moment. It drew surveillance attention while smaller units repositioned unseen. It absorbed focus while real maneuver unfolded elsewhere. It wasn't indestructible, it was unpredictable, and unpredictability forces recalculation. Every recalculation consumes seconds. Seconds accumulate. The first engagement was brief and confusing. Target locks hesitated. Thermal readings misread mass. Visual confirmation lagged because the silhouette didn't match known armor templates. By the time classification caught up, the Australians had already shifted position. The machine had served its purpose, not as a weapon of brute force, but as a wedge in the decision cycle. Larger forces win when their systems move smoothly from detection to response. Interrupt that smoothness and the edge dulls. What looked like a joke became leverage. What looked like scrap became tempo control. And once tempo changes hands, scale starts to feel heavy. The second phase exposed the deeper design. The vehicle was never meant to trade shots with modern armor. It was engineered to distort battlefield geometry. Its armor plating was uneven by intention, scattering radar return in inconsistent patterns. Its exhaust signature fluctuated because the engine had been modified to vent irregularly, creating heat ghosts across sensor feeds. To a human observer it looked crude. To automated systems it looked ambiguous. Ambiguity is dangerous in a force that depends on classification before engagement. The U.S. units in the sector followed doctrine: identify, categorize, respond with proportional asset. But proportionality requires certainty. Every time certainty wavered, the response window widened. The Australians exploited that widening. While the improvised tank drew surveillance and forced repositioning of heavier American assets, light Australian elements maneuvered along secondary ridgelines and supply corridors. The machine was noise. The operators were signal. Several times the vehicle deliberately exposed itself at distance, inviting pursuit. Pursuit redirected armored columns into terrain that constrained mobility. Narrow passes, soft ground, urban edges where large formations could not fully deploy. Each redirection was minor on its own. Together they fractured cohesion. U.S. command increased drone coverage, saturating the area to pin the anomaly, but saturation produces overload. Multiple feeds began flagging inconsistent data, heat signatures that appeared and vanished, metallic reflections where none should exist. Analysts debated whether the Australians possessed unconventional tech. In reality, they possessed asymmetry of design. The so-called scrap tank did not conform to predictive modeling, and predictive modeling drives modern reaction speed. The first confirmed exchange came when the vehicle absorbed fire that should have disabled it instantly. Improvised reinforcement held just long enough for smoke deployment to obscure visual lock. It withdrew behind terrain, not in panic, but in timing. That moment forced reassessment. If it could survive direct contact even briefly, it had to be respected as armor. Respect demands resource allocation. Allocation thins elsewhere. That was the pivot. The Americans were no longer ignoring the machine. They were planning around it. And planning around a distraction is the beginning of strategic misdirection. The Australians understood scale. They knew they could not overpower a larger army in sustained engagement, but they could make it pivot repeatedly, burning momentum each time. The tank's presence distorted planning maps. Commanders adjusted projected movement arcs. Logistics routes shifted to avoid potential ambush angles. Air support was reassigned to track a machine built from scrap. Every reassignment created a gap somewhere else. The Australians moved through those gaps quietly. What appeared reckless was actually calibrated exposure. The improvised armor existed not to win battles, but to compress decision time until the larger force reacted predictably. And once reaction becomes predictable, control begins to change hands. By the third operational cycle, the improvised tank had become a psychological variable rather than a mechanical one. Reports referenced it constantly. Movement plans included contingency notes for its appearance. Drone operators scanned specifically for its irregular silhouette. When a machine built from scrap becomes central to a modern forces planning matrix, imbalance has already taken root. The Australians amplified that effect deliberately. Sometimes the vehicle appeared briefly at long range, firing just enough to trigger counter-battery alignment before vanishing into broken terrain. Other times it stayed silent for hours, forcing U.S. units to operate under the expectation of sudden contact. Expectation drains focus. Focus divided is momentum reduced. The larger army escalated tracking protocols, dedicating more ISR assets to isolating the anomaly, but the more they searched, the more they exposed how dependent they were on pattern recognition. The tank did not follow pattern, it doubled back unpredictably. It idled in zones considered tactically irrelevant. It used debris fields and urban clutter as camouflage, blending into environments that sophisticated systems filtered as background noise. Every time classification hesitated, the Australians gained seconds. Seconds turned into maneuver space. Maneuver space turned into leverage. Meanwhile, light Australian units exploited supply chain fragility, not through large-scale destruction, but through timing. A delayed fuel convoy here, a rerouted ammunition column there. Minor disruptions synchronized with the tank's appearances. To U.S. command, the battlefield began to look chaotic. In reality, it was sequenced. The improvised armor drew strength away from decisive axes. Heavy units repositioned to contain a threat that refused to behave like armor. Air elements orbited longer than necessary, burning fuel cycles tracking heat signatures that dissolved. The Australians understood the principle clearly. You do not need to match power if you can misdirect it. The first confirmed destruction attributed to the scrap-built tank was less significant than the confusion surrounding it. Targeting systems miscalculated angle and distance because the silhouette distorted range assumptions. That brief misread allowed the Australians to strike and withdraw before concentrated retaliation aligned. It was not dominance, it was incision, and incisions accumulate. By now the U.S. force was fighting two battles, one against physical harassment, another against uncertainty in its own sensors. When sensors are questioned, confidence erodes. When confidence erodes, caution increases. Increased caution slows tempo. And tempo, once lost, is difficult to reclaim against a force that designed the battlefield around unpredictability. The scrap tank was never the centerpiece of destruction. It was the hinge. And the hinge kept turning until the larger structure found itself reacting to a machine it should have dismissed, but no longer could ignore. By the time higher command intervened, the problem was no longer tactical, it was structural. The improvised tank had forced the U.S. force to redesign its engagement flow mid-operation. Additional verification layers were added before committing armor. Air assets required cross-confirmation before strike authorization. Ground units hesitated half-seconds longer when anomalous readings appeared. Those half-seconds compounded. The Australians anticipated the slowdown and tightened pressure precisely when reaction windows widened. The scrap-built vehicle began operating closer to contested zones, exploiting the hesitation it had created. It would expose itself just enough to trigger tracking, then pivot sharply into terrain that forced American armor into narrow approach lanes. Those lanes became predictable. Predictability is exploitable. Light Australian teams seeded those approach routes with targeted disruption, not overwhelming force, just enough to fragment cohesion. A stalled column here, a misaligned advance there. The larger army still had overwhelming firepower, but it was increasingly misapplied. Assets concentrated on the anomaly, while smaller movements elsewhere went under-addressed. The battlefield map began to distort around one irregular object. Analysts inside command centers debated whether the Australians possessed unconventional engineering capability far beyond expectations. The truth was simpler: they possessed intent clarity. The scrap tank was not meant to survive indefinitely, it was meant to bend reaction arcs. And it succeeded. When a major armored element attempted to isolate and neutralize it decisively, the Australians shifted entirely away from confrontation. The vehicle withdrew into terrain previously deemed tactically insignificant. U.S. armor pursued cautiously, wary of ambush. That caution slowed them further. Meanwhile, Australian ground elements struck at stretched logistics nodes now lightly protected due to resource redistribution. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to destabilize flow. Flow is the bloodstream of large forces. Disrupt flow and strength stagnates. The pivotal moment came not with destruction, but with overcommitment. A substantial U.S. detachment locked onto the scrap tank's position, committing aerial and ground assets simultaneously to end the anomaly. The Australians anticipated this convergence. At the last moment, the vehicle redirected, drawing those assets deeper into constrained ground, while secondary Australian elements exploited the vacuum left behind. Command realized too late that it had concentrated power on a distraction. By the time the scrap tank was finally disabled, inevitable given the imbalance in raw capability, the operational landscape had already shifted. Key routes had been compromised. Forward momentum had stalled. Planning cycles were behind schedule. The machine's destruction did not restore initiative, because the initiative had never been inside the machine, it had been in the sequencing. A vehicle built from scrap and sticks had served its purpose, forcing a superior army to pivot repeatedly, burning tempo each time, and once tempo is lost in modern warfare, regaining it requires more than eliminating a target. It requires regaining confidence in your own reaction speed. That confidence had already been shaken. When the scrap-built tank finally burned out on the edge of a shattered ridge, it did not mark victory for the larger force. It marked the end of a phase. The Americans had eliminated the object. They had not eliminated the distortion it created. By the time the vehicle was reduced to twisted metal, the operational timeline was already compromised. Movements were delayed, supply intervals misaligned, command cycles stretched thinner than intended. The Australians had anticipated the tank's destruction from the beginning. It was never designed for longevity, it was designed for effect, and effect had already been achieved. The larger army now operated differently than it had at the start. More cautious, more layered, slower to commit. That shift alone represented strategic impact, because momentum, once interrupted repeatedly, does not immediately return to full velocity. The Australians transitioned seamlessly after the vehicle's loss. Without the visual anchor of the anomaly, U.S. units expected a lull. Instead, they encountered precise, small-scale strikes on already strained nodes, fuel caches forced into relocation, communication relays briefly disrupted, forward observation elements pressured at calculated intervals. Nothing overwhelming, just enough to prevent rhythm from re-establishing. The scrap tank had been the opening move in a longer sequence. It bent the battlefield's geometry. It forced assets into positions they would not have otherwise occupied. It made the larger force reveal how it prioritized threats. Once those priorities were mapped, the Australians adjusted accordingly. That is the hidden layer of the story. The machine itself was crude by design. The strategy behind it was not. It demonstrated a principle modern forces rarely confront directly. Technological superiority assumes threat familiarity. Introduce unfamiliarity, and the system must slow down to interpret. Interpretation costs time. Time shifts initiative. By the final operational window, the U.S. force still possessed overwhelming hardware and manpower, but it no longer operated with uninterrupted tempo. Every movement was filtered through the memory of having been redirected by something dismissed at first glance. That memory affects decision speed. Decision speed affects dominance. The Australians did not need to annihilate an army to claim advantage. They needed to prove it could be maneuvered cognitively. A tank built from scrap and sticks became the instrument of that proof. It absorbed attention, bent trajectories, and exposed dependency on classification-driven warfare. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield looked largely intact. Armor still stood, aircraft still flew, personnel remained disciplined and capable, yet something fundamental had shifted. Superiority had proven conditional, and once conditionality is exposed, it cannot be unseen. The Australians walked away lighter, having lost a machine but gained leverage. The larger army remained powerful, but now aware that even dominance can be redirected by simplicity applied at the right angle. After the smoke settled and reports were consolidated, the most uncomfortable realization surfaced quietly. The Australians had dictated the narrative arc of the engagement from the first weld to the final spark. The scrap-built tank was never a miracle weapon. It was a probe, a moving question mark inserted into a battlefield optimized for known categories. The U.S. force had trained for armored threats, irregular threats, hybrid threats, but not for something that refused clean definition, and that refusal forced adaptation under pressure. Adaptation under pressure consumes clarity. Clarity is the currency of large-scale command. Once clarity thins, hesitation fills the gap. The Australians measured that hesitation like engineers measuring stress on a beam. Each appearance of the tank increased cognitive load. Each disappearance increased suspicion. By the time it was destroyed, the Americans had already altered patrol spacing, air allocation, armor posture, and conformation chains. None of those adjustments were fatal, but all of them cost momentum. Momentum is invisible until it's gone. The brilliance was not mechanical, it was structural. The tank's irregular armor angles distorted range estimation just enough to buy seconds. Its modified exhaust created thermal inconsistencies that complicated automated tracking. Its movement patterns rejected textbook armored doctrine. It behaved like something in between categories, and modern systems are optimized for categories. When something sits between them, response algorithms slow. Human commanders step in. Human confirmation takes longer than automated lock. Those seconds were harvested repeatedly. Meanwhile, Australian ground elements exploited every redistribution of attention. They struck where coverage thinned, withdrew before escalation, and reappeared where expectation was weakest. It was orchestration, not chaos. When external observers later asked how a machine built from scrap could influence a superior force so dramatically, the answer was simple. It wasn't the machine, it was the sequence. The tank bent perception, perception bent deployment, deployment bent tempo, and tempo determines who controls the battlefield. By the final operational review, the U.S. force had regained physical stability but lost its initial velocity. It had learned to treat anomalies with caution rather than dismissal. That lesson carries weight, because in future engagements, hesitation will surface faster. And hesitation against a lighter, more adaptive force can reopen the same vulnerability. The Australians proved something fundamental without ever fielding conventional parity. Dominance is fragile when it depends on predictability. A scrap-built tank exposed that fragility not by overpowering it, but by revealing it. And once revealed, it becomes part of the equation forever. In the long-term analysis, the operation stopped being about improvisation and started being about exposure. The scrap-built tank had forced a technologically superior force to confront a blind spot it didn't know it had. Not a weakness in firepower, not a lack of manpower, a blind spot in expectation. Modern armies are optimized for efficiency, rapid classification, rapid targeting, rapid escalation. Efficiency assumes clean inputs. Clean inputs produce clean outputs. The Australians introduced noise into that system. Not overwhelming noise, just enough distortion to force manual override again and again. Every manual override is friction. Friction slows the machine, and when the machine slows, lighter elements can move around it. By the end of the engagement, U.S. units were no longer dismissing irregular constructs as low-threat anomalies. They were assigning real resources to ambiguity. That shift is expensive, because ambiguity is infinite. You cannot allocate overwhelming force to every undefined signal. The Australians understood that resource strain scales upward. A small team can operate indefinitely inside uncertainty. A large force cannot. Large forces require clarity to justify allocation. When clarity fragments, allocation becomes cautious. Caution reduces initiative. The scrap tank's destruction did not restore the original operational posture, because posture is mental before it is physical. Commanders now questioned sensor reads more carefully. Drone operators double-checked unusual silhouettes. Armor commanders hesitated before committing to pursuit through constrained terrain. That hesitation was rational, it was also slow, and speed is dominance. The Australians walked away having demonstrated a principle larger than the battlefield itself. Technological superiority without adaptive interpretation is brittle. You can harden armor, you can expand surveillance, you can reinforce doctrine, but if your system cannot handle anomalies without slowing down, it can be manipulated. A vehicle built from debris and field parts had not crushed an army through raw power, it had bent it through cognitive overload. It forced the stronger force to reveal how it thinks, and once thinking patterns are revealed, they can be anticipated. That is the real weapon that was deployed. Not scrap metal, not improvised plating, but foresight. The final lesson lingered long after the wreckage cooled. In modern conflict, the side that defines the problem defines the pace. The Australians defined the problem, the US force responded to it. And from that moment, the battlefield no longer belonged to the heaviest armor. It belonged to the one shaping perception. In the end, it was never about the scrap tank. It was never about the debris, the patched armor, or the audacity of rolling something so crude against something so advanced. It was about a message. 20 Australians stepped onto a battlefield dominated by scale, technology, and overwhelming force, and they refused to play by its rules. They didn't try to match firepower. They didn't try to win through brute strength. They forced a superior army to hesitate. They forced it to question. They forced it to slow down. And once that happened, the balance shifted. The wreckage of that improvised machine became irrelevant. What mattered was the disruption it created, the rhythm it broke, the certainty it cracked. A division built for precision and dominance had been dragged into uncertainty by a handful of operators who understood one simple truth: control the perception and you control the pace. The Australians walked away not because they destroyed an army in the literal sense, but because they proved something far more dangerous. Superiority can be bent. When the stronger side is reacting instead of dictating, the battlefield belongs to the one shaping the problem. And that was the real victory. Not scrap metal, not fury, but mindset.